Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Kevin from Fiveable, working tonight on some AP Lang review, focusing on rhetorical analysis. So it's been a while since I've covered rhetorical analysis on Fiveable. It was in the fall, and it's definitely the time of year that we're just going to start reviewing all parts of the test. So we'll actually spend a couple weeks doing a deep dive into rhetorical analysis. If you were with me in the fall, I'm not going to completely go as deep into those topics. In the fall, there's live session reviews on how to accurately read a text, how to get into the rhetorical analysis mindset, and then there's some deep dives into an effective intro and an effective body paragraph. So those are super important. Today we're going to look at kind of pulling back, looking at a bigger picture view of rhetorical analysis. And when we do that, we're going to move even higher up on the rigor scale compared to what we did in the fall. So tonight we are going to be looking at how to track an author's argument from beginning, middle to end. This is a very good way to read any work, but let's talk specifically about rhetorical analysis prompts. When you look at rhetorical analysis prompts, really considering why does the author start where he or she starts? Why does he or she move to whatever the tactic is of the writer? And then why does the writer end how he or she ends? So that's our focus tonight. I'm going to run through a sample prompt and really do a deep dive on how to think through just a high level reading and then how I would translate that into writing. So you won't see from me any sample paragraphs tonight like I've done in the past, but just looking at this is how to effectively read rhetorical analysis prompts, and this is how to open up doors to higher level scores. So I've been an AP reader for several years. My first 2 years reading officially for AP College Board was rhetorical analysis. And that was about 5-6 years ago at this point. But I've read several times rhetorical analysis prompts, and I will tell you this technique I didn't know this until I went and was a reader myself, how important this technique is in raising those scores. So I was teaching my students a little bit differently, but ever since going to that reading the first year or two, I realized this opens up doors to higher level analysis. So let's jump in tonight. If there are any questions tonight, please let me know, and I'll be checking in and out of the question slot, just in case there are any. Please feel free to ask. I've appreciated the question. This is an exact same slide, just threw back up on our slide tonight. Always start thinking about a rhetorical analysis prompt with this image in your head: the relationship between speaker, subject, subject audience, and audience speaker. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide tonight. Just as a review, we need to be thinking about how these three things, these three components, are intertwined and interconnected. What does the audience think about the subject before hearing the speaker's words on the subject? And therefore, how does the speaker, anticipating the audience's beliefs, deliberately choose writing techniques to change the audience's mindset or to reinforce the audience's already existing beliefs? So the speaker has to kind of think, okay, what does the audience believe about the subject? And then as an outsider, we're getting into the audience's head and the speaker's head. Okay, how is the speaker, what is he or she assuming about the audience, and how is the writer intentionally making some decisions to move the audience where they want to move them? So in a nutshell, this is the task of rhetorical analysis. You are going to identify and explain what is effective about a particular argument. So always think about it, and this is totally review, but every single thing that you read in rhetorical analysis is someone else's argument. Now in synthesis and an argument essay, it's your argument. So this is the one task that's a little bit different in terms of the 3 essays. This time, again, view yourself as an outsider talking about the rhetorical situation. The rhetorical situation right here. Okay, in order to do this task, here's 3 things that you must do. So first, you have to identify the primary purpose. Always read the top 1 or 2 sentences, honestly, that College Board provides. They give you some crucial information. Who's the speaker? What is a little bit of information regarding the occasion of the work. They will tell you the topic oftentimes, but they will rarely tell you the primary purpose. So many of my students, every prompt that I give them, they can tell me the topic right off the bat, but it takes them a couple more minutes, and sometimes they slightly are like getting closer, but slightly are off on what the primary purpose exactly is. So your primary task, like as you're reading, is to identify what exactly is the author setting out to prove. That's the primary purpose. What is the author's core argument? All right, and then second, this is our focus tonight, identifying the most important writing choices that the writer makes. You can't identify that unless you have a good understanding of the audience, which is our focus next week. But it's impossible to separate them fully. So tonight we're focusing on speaker. Next week we're focusing on audience, but both times we have to have an understanding of that rhetorical triangle because they are so interconnected. So I'm going to show you tonight a great way to split your mindset into beginning, middle, and end when you're identifying the most impactful writing choices. And then lastly, again, you can't get away from the audience. Consider how these writing choices would impact the intended audience. Again, you can't do that without getting into the audience's head a little bit. Who's the audience? What might they believe about the topic before hearing the author's words? All right, and I have a couple more slides here just as quick review, and then we'll talk about a potential time breakdown. I get a lot of questions on how should I budget my time, so we'll do that, and then we'll look into a sample essay prompt tonight. All right, so audience subject, this is the core of the relationship. You've heard me say this just a second ago. What you have to put your thinking cap on and think, okay, what do I know about the subject? What do I know about the intended audience at the time? What does the audience probably believe about the subject before hearing the author's words? You have to just make some inferences here. Now, caution, don't make stuff up, but tell me as much as you can tell me based on your background knowledge in the essay. And then second, how does the author carefully consider the audience's projected beliefs? So again, you're getting in the audience's head, and then you're getting into the speaker's head. Now, again, you've heard me say this at the beginning tonight. The speaker is trying to do one of two things to his or her audience: reinforcing the audience's belief or changing their mind about the subject. Now, you'll see in a lot of high-level AP prompts, there's going to be a little bit of both. There might be, I'm reinforcing these three things that you and I both believe as the speaker and audience, and then finally and ultimately, I'm challenging a mindset, like for my fourth point. So that's why I think this beginning, middle, and end might be a really effective thing for you to start to practice in terms of organizing your writing choices that you've identified. I'm going to talk tonight with that model, but just a quick preview on that. Let's just use that hypothetical prompt that I broke down. So I have three things where myself as the speaker, I'm aligning to my audience. And then the fourth and final point, I'm challenging you and I'm trying to change your mindset. Well, the cause that fourth thing is fourth is actually very impactful and very purposeful. So I would spend a lot of time in my essay unpacking why the first 75% of the speaker's essay or speech or whatever it is was aligning himself with his audience, and that ultimately prepares his audience to be willing to change their mindset. So that's just a hypothetical. We'll get into a practical example tonight, but that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. When you go beginning, middle, and end, it opens up doors to higher level analysis. Consider starting off with X writing strategy. Don't just tell me what the strategy is and how the audience would think. Tell me why the speaker starts exactly where he or she starts. All right, let's take a couple minutes just to plan out your timing. If you were with me in the fall, I have not changed anything up on you. This is just a quick review. There are many ways to write a great essay. For every type of essay through Fiveable, I've compiled, because I've read for the three different types, argument, synthesis, and analysis, I've compiled the best possible or the most frequently successful techniques. So you don't have to use my timing breakdown. You don't have to use my body paragraph frames that I've provided in the past, but you have to have a plan that's going to work for you. And if you're not consistently writing sixes, use my plan. Why not? My plan will get you to sixes and higher. if you can pull it off within the 40 minutes. So let's talk about timing. Timing is a big deal on these essays. So I suggest spending about 12 minutes really thinking through and reading and processing and planning out what to write about. So you're going to read the text. You're going to focus on a high level nuanced comprehension of the text. What I mean by that is all my students understand the text to a certain extent. They can all tell me the topic, like I said, every time. But I want you to be one who can tell me this is the exact purpose of the text, and this is exactly what the author says in each paragraph. Like really understand the details of the text, not just the big picture. And then keeping the audience in mind, focus on what writing choices were most effective. And again, I suggest today splitting it beginning, middle, and end, or at least exposing you to this organizational technique. So let's say that takes you about 12 minutes. Take about 6 to write your intro. I've had, again, a replay that is accessible to Fiverr Plus members. Go back and check that out if you were not with us in the fall. That's a really important live session. Intros often are not done well. Again, I'm only saying it takes 6 minutes on it, but if you really want to set your essay apart, check out my live session on that. In a nutshell, you're providing unique context. You're emphasizing what's happening in the world in relation to the subject at the time of the writing. So it's going to take you 6 minutes, and of course your thesis will be the last sentence there. Thesis will identify the purpose and the overall writing strategies that you will unpack in your essay. All right, so the majority of your time is going to be in your body paragraphs. 18 minutes doesn't sound like a lot. Some of my students can write a really great body paragraph in 6 minutes. Most of mine take closer to 9. So most of mine are going to write 2 body paragraphs, and that's just fine. So I emphasize on my slide that it is about quality more than quantity. So for my beginning, middle, and end organizational pattern, that is implicitly saying you're going to have 3 body paragraphs. However, you can take the strategy to say, okay, the first half of the essay or the last half of the essay, or talk about a chunk at a time. If you're going to talk about a strategy in the first paragraph at the beginning of the essay, you should absolutely still unpack why the author started there. And likewise, if you're at the end, why did the author end with this technique? So with all that said, choose if you're going to have 2 or 3 body paragraphs. On May 15th, you should walk into the rhetorical analysis prompt, and for that matter, every essay, knowing exactly what your plan A looks like. And again, for most of my students, that's 2 body paragraphs, pretty solid intro, and a quick conclusion. So again, 2 great body paragraphs are better than 3 mediocre ones. And to be honest, I see 3 mediocre paragraphs quite often when I'm reading essays. So no matter what, plan out how you are organizing your essay. Not just, I'm going to have 2 body paragraphs, but why is your first body paragraph about X topic and your final body paragraph about Y topic? Why put it in that order? Again, my slides tonight will show you if you go the beginning, middle, and end route, they're going to kind of organize themselves. So you're just kind of tracking the author's flow of the text. And then a quick conclusion, couple minutes. We're not going to stress out about that tonight. In a couple minutes, quickly rehash the rhetorical situation, that rhetorical triangle we talked about. What's the relationship between audience, subject, and speaker? How does the speaker try to move his or her audience? And then I always recommend spending 2 minutes to proofread and revise. It is such a thing that if I make my students go back and reread their work, they always want to self-edit on the fly because they're writing in a 40-minute time setting. The stakes are high. They're writing so fast. They're processing faster than they can write, or they're thinking faster than they can write. So sometimes they just make silly mistakes or even skip words. Just take 2 minutes, maybe not anything more than that, because you want to spend most of your time actually writing. But make sure you do not make any simple, easy to fix mistakes. All right, so in a nutshell, before we practice tonight, here is what I recommend, or what I'm providing as one potential time plan. So 12 minutes, and this is the most important step. Read the text, get the primary purpose, plan out what you're going to write about. If you don't do that step well, or if you rush that step, the next 28 minutes are not going to be as effective. Write your intro, take most of the time to write your body paragraphs, quick conclusion, couple minutes to proofread and revise. I recommend proofreading and revising for 2 minutes before moving on to your next essay. Proofread and revise it while it's fresh. All right, so tonight I'm going to show you a prompt that's a previous rhetorical analysis prompt, and I will basically provide the annotation. So here's how I would annotate. You can annotate to save yourself time. If you're with me with a multiple choice review, you know I'm a big believer in annotations, not just to engage, although that's absolutely a reason why you should annotate, but also to save you time. Again, we are under considerable time restraints. Annotations actually in that 12-minute reading will really help out. You don't have to go back and do a lot of rereading during the body paragraph writing. You're spending most of those 18 minutes actually writing. So annotate, underline the most important phrases. Maybe you'll go back and quote part of them. That's just to focus on comprehension. But in the margins, you're not focusing on comprehension necessarily. Do it if you need to or if you want to. But you're writing a quick primary writing choice that you've noticed in each paragraph or chunk of text. It depends on the length of the paragraphs, how you want to organize that. Very important. I had a whole live session on it in the fall. This is not a matching game. Don't just write down pathos, ethos, logos, or any other terminology for that matter. This is not looking for rhetorical terms. Don't write repetition, allusion. This is looking for actual thinking and writing, not just applying, oh, I found an anaphora. It's actually, this is exactly what the author's doing. Now think about it this way. If I was to just ask you casually, how did the author prove his or her point? Like taking the AP constraints out of the conversation. You would not naturally say by repetition. You would say what's actually happening in the bigger picture by getting the audience on his side, and then by challenging the audience's mindset at the very end. Or you can say maybe by using a lot of historical anecdotes. But that fancy word is not what I'm looking for. What is the author actually doing? So you can absolutely talk about repetition, emotional appeal, etc. in your body paragraphs, but I do not recommend that being at the forefront of your mind in terms of annotations, and definitely not for organizing your thoughts. So I'll show you some examples of topic sentences tonight as we push further into this process. All right, but before we go, look for a logical pattern. How does the author track the argument from beginning to middle to end? And that's what I want you looking for. So first, you're just going to read through it. Once you read through it, and once we read one together tonight, you'll go back and you'll just chunk the text. Here's kind of the first third, here's the middle third, here's the final third. It doesn't have to be equal thirds, but how does the author shift from beginning to middle to end? That's what we'll analyze together tonight. All right, so this is the background information, a couple sentences at the top. Always take your time to actually read and understand this. This is what's getting you into who is the audience, and you're starting to think, what would the audience believe before reading the work? I'm going to take a quick pause to make sure we're good. Okay. I had technology issues a couple weeks ago, and I want to make sure we were not having any tonight. All right, so the passage is from The Indispensable Opposition, an article by Walter Lippmann. It appeared in the Atlantic Monthly in 1939. That is crucial to just put myself into that mindset. This is an American audience in the late 1930s. All right, so read the passage carefully. This is just the prompt now. Write an essay in which you analyze the rhetorical strategies. I put in parentheses writing choices because that is the language that College Board more recently has been using. So analyze the writing choices Lippmann uses to develop his argument. So it doesn't tell us the topic. It doesn't tell us at all the purpose. I have to identify that as I'm reading. Let's read it together. So on the left, I've underlined what I would underline, and I just did a quick annotation. Now my annotations are a little bit longer than they would be if I was doing this under a time setting, simply because I want you to use shorthand. Make sure you understand your annotations, but don't take a lot of time actually writing them. The hard part is thinking about what to write, but that's the whole point of the task. That should take you 5 seconds per paragraph to jot yourself a note. What's the overall writing strategy? So just note these are not as short as I would have them, but I wanted to make sure A, it was clear, and B, if you're looking at it and you're pulling the slides, this is a standalone document. So we're going to read what's on the left. Notice especially what I've underlined, and then we'll just look at, okay, here's the primary writing strategy for every paragraph. Notice one thing before I read, I'll point it out at the beginning. I recommend underlining like I've underlined. Don't feel like you have to underline every word of a sentence. Pull out the core phrasing that actually helps you comprehend. Sometimes AP, for example, you see between these dashes, will have passages with very lengthy sentences. Cut to the chase, underline what the core clause or clauses are. Let's go. Were they pressed hard enough, most men would probably confess that political freedom, that is to say, the right to speak freely and to act in opposition, is a noble ideal rather than a practical necessity. Now just pull back. When I go back and reread that, I have to read every word. I have to understand every word. But the best readers know that not every word is created equal, or not every phrase is created equal. Here's how I would read that sentence again. Just my underline. Most men would probably confess that political freedom is a noble ideal rather than a practical necessity. That's just a lot more clear, and I can save time when I reread that. All right, let's keep reading. As the case for freedom is generally put today, the argument lends itself to this feeling. Again, the feeling that freedom is a noble ideal rather than a practical necessity. It is made to appear, so this is the appearance, not necessarily the reality. It is made to appear that, whereas each man claims his freedom as a matter of right, the freedom he accords to other men is a matter of toleration. Thus, the defense of freedom of opinion tends to rest not on its substantial, beneficial, and indispensable consequences, but on a somewhat eccentric, or rather vaguely benevolent attachment to an abstraction. Again, pretty high level paragraph here in terms of just I've got to be at my best to comprehend the nuance. I get the topics of freedom of expression, but what is he exactly saying? So go back with me for the last sentence. Just read what I've underlined to get to the core of the message. And then obviously the comprehension skill is you can underline the most important pieces to pull out. The defense of freedom of opinion tends to rest on a somewhat eccentric attachment to an abstraction. All right, the defense of freedom of opinion tends to rest. So this is how men generally defend the freedom of opinion. A somewhat eccentric attachment to an abstraction. So he's saying they like the idea of freedom more than the practical use and application of freedom. So my annotations, at the very beginning, the first paragraph, Lippmann identifies that freedom is an ideal rather than a need. I'm going to talk about the dangers of summary and how this is not a summary at the end of my slides tonight. But actually, let's pause before I go any further, because some of you might be thinking, aren't you just summarizing? So what I'm doing here, I'm not summarizing. I'm not getting every piece of information. I'm not focusing on like for every paragraph, all of the nuance. Sometimes it might be a little summary feel, but I'm focusing on what is he doing. This is the writing choice. And again, put the lens on of beginning, middle, and end. So at the very beginning, Lippmann chooses to address the freedom, that freedom is an ideal rather than a need. So he's choosing, and you might word that differently, but essentially he's choosing to state something that most of his audience would not realize or have thought about. So he's challenging, and you might write that in your annotations too, he's challenging the audience's beliefs about freedom of opinion. So that's going to be part of my analysis in a body paragraph. He challenges their opinions at the very beginning, and why would he do that? So I'll talk about that, and once we finish the passage, I'll show you what my analysis would look like. Not a whole body paragraph, just essentially what would I be saying. But so I won't talk about summary until the end, but I did want to put that out there. This is not a summary. I'm just pulling out the most important writing choice that he makes. Okay, with all of that said, for the rest of the slides for the passage, I'll just run through. Here's what I would identify in the margins, and here's what I would underline. Let's make sure you're, again, pushing for nuanced comprehension. All right, so the second paragraph is much shorter. It is all very well to say with Voltaire, I wholly disapprove of what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. But as a matter of fact, and here's my underline, so focus in on this part, most men will not defend to the death the rights of other men. If they disapprove sufficiently what other men say, they will somehow suppress those men if they can. All right, if you just cut to the core of the sentence, and if you can identify the core of the sentence, which I've underlined, this is a pretty easy paragraph to comprehend. Now, what is the writing strategy? So then Lippmann moves to identifying society's hypocrisy regarding freedom of opinion. We see that here. They'll say, yeah, I'll fight for the death, your right to defend, or I'm sorry, I'll fight to the death, your right to say what you want. When in reality, people actually suppress people who disagree with them, quite opposite of fighting to the death to defend their right to speech. So he's identifying their hypocrisy for sure. All right, next paragraph is also pretty short. So, if this is the best that can be said for liberty of opinion, that a man must tolerate his opponents because everyone has a right to say what he pleases, then we shall find that liberty of opinion is a luxury, safe only in pleasant times, when men can be tolerant because they are not deeply and vitally concerned. So it's, again, a really long, complex sentence here. Let's break it down to the core. If this is the best that can be said for liberty of opinion, then we shall find that liberty of opinion is a luxury, safe only in pleasant times. Okay, so I'm just going to pull out, he's noting the flaw in not truly valuing freedom of opinion. He's saying there is a fatal flaw here if we only say it but don't actually put into practice valuing others' opinions. So comprehension wise, I would just say Lippmann says if we don't actually value others' opinions, we will not put freedom of speech into practice when it becomes uncomfortable, something like that, right? So I'm saying it differently in my annotations. He's noting that there's a huge flaw in the current way that society values freedom of opinion. Now, before I go further, remember this is 1939, so just keep our mindset there. All right, this one's a longer paragraph. Let's read it. Yet, actually, as a matter of historic fact, there is a much stronger foundation for the great constitutional right of freedom of speech. And as a matter of practical human experience, there is a much more compelling reason for cultivating the habits of free men. We take, it seems to me, a naively self-righteous view when we argue as if the right of our opponents to speak were something that we protect because we are magnanimous, noble, and unselfish. The compelling reason why, if liberty of opinion did not exist, we should have to invent it. Why? It will eventually have to be restored in all civilized countries where it is now suppressed. So the compelling reason why we should have to invent it is that we must protect the right of our opponents to speak because we must hear what they have to say. So just comprehension of this paragraph. He says, we pat ourselves on the back too much. We don't actually value freedom of opinion nearly as much as we like to say that we do. What we really need to focus on, though, is we absolutely need to not just tolerate other people's thoughts, but listen to them. We need to hear what they have to say. Now, let's pull back to my annotations. Lippmann criticizes the self-righteous view of protecting freedom of opinion. And really, that's in the first half of this paragraph. That's what I'm going to pull out. This last sentence is kind of a transition that launches us into the final, and yes, longest paragraph here. So this is the final paragraph of the passage. Let's read and let's comprehend, and then we'll pull back and look at the big picture. We miss the whole point when we imagine that we tolerate the freedom of our political opponents as we tolerate a howling baby next door. I just love that metaphor or simile. It's not about toleration he's focusing on. So let's keep reading. As we put up with the blasts from our neighbor's radio because we are too peaceable to have a brick. To heave a brick. through the window. In other words, this is not about toleration. That should not be how we view freedom of opinion. We should not view people who say something different than us as the equivalent of an annoying neighbor or a screaming baby. If this were all there is to freedom of opinion, let's keep reading, that we are too good-natured or too timid to do anything about our opponents and our critics except to let them talk, it would be difficult to say, and this is a very hit you in the face type of sentence, it would be difficult to say whether we are tolerant because we are magnanimous or because we are lazy, because we have strong principles, or because we lack serious convictions, whether we have the hospitality of an inquiring mind or the indifference of an empty mind. And so, if we truly wish to understand why freedom is necessary in a civilized society, we must begin by realizing that because freedom of discussion improves our own opinions, the liberties of other men are our own vital necessity. So that last sentence essentially is his primary purpose. I'm going to take a couple minutes on the slide and then we'll break it up going back full picture. Let's read the last sentence again. This is his primary purpose. The last sentence of the passage is his driving point. So he builds to his primary purpose all throughout the passage to get here. If we truly wish to understand why freedom is necessary in a civilized society, we must begin by realizing that, let's cut, the liberties of other men are our own vital necessity. Again, we can't just tolerate people, we must listen to them in order to be truly free. Now, let's look at my annotations for this final paragraph. So Lippmann ends his passage by saying, or by emphasizing, the need to seek others' opinions rather than merely tolerate them. He juxtaposes, and you can word that in a different way. He juxtaposes, there's a lot of juxtaposition happening here, but don't just say juxtaposition. Say juxtaposes X with Y. So he juxtaposes what tolerance looks like versus valuing others' opinions looks like. And obviously he puts preference on the value. Let's go back to the middle portion here, and let's talk about just very practical application of analysis. So it would be difficult to say, and now look at this juxtaposition. This is positive, and then very, very critically negative. So the audience would say, okay, we're pretty positive about this. We tolerate people. We're tolerant. So they would align themselves on the first of these three series. But he's pushing them to say, hey, are you the first or are you the second? So the first is positive. The second is very negative. Let's read. It would be difficult to say whether we are tolerant because we are magnanimous or lazy, because we have strong principles or we lack serious convictions. I didn't underline the third, but still worth looking at. Whether we have the hospitality of an inquiring mind, positive, or an empty mind, very critically negative. What he's saying is, take away what you think, like what you would call yourself, and think about who you actually are. Why are you actually tolerant? Because if you're tolerant just for tolerance sake, maybe you're just lazy. That's a very strong way to end his passage. Now, I'm going to pull back, and let's really look at how does this flow from beginning, middle to end. How does he, and this is a great one to look at because his primary purpose is basically his last sentence. So how does he build to that primary purpose? And how does he do so effectively? All right, so again, I've got to be thinking, I should have been thinking this the whole time. I was talking about it a little bit, but let's really think about it. Before reading the piece, now we know the subject is freedom of opinion. We know exactly what his purpose is. What would his audience think? Well, again, they would think that they value freedom. Like, he's talking exactly what American society, like the average American would think in 1939 about this topic. So we can just assume the average American would think that they value freedom of opinion, but really they just tolerate people's opinions. And again, I'm kind of taking off, I'm assuming he's talking about a common problem. So I'm assuming that a common problem is he tolerates others, or we would tolerate others' opinions, but we actually don't listen to them. We actually don't value them. We don't seek them out. We're just like, yeah, that's fine. You can believe your thing. I'm going to go close the window because it's getting loud outside, right? In my metaphor, I don't want to hear, but I can tolerate you. I won't complain about you, but I'm not going to listen. So that's what the audience is thinking. So again, they don't see this as a problem. They actually think, no, we're great. We tolerate others. We're very tolerable. He's pushing them to say tolerance is not enough. So I'm going to put the primary purpose in my own words, and I always want you to do that. I always tell my students, if you can't tell me, like if you're taking the time to essay, if I couldn't pause you as soon as you're done reading, and if you couldn't tell me what is the primary purpose, you're not ready to write. You have to be able to identify the exact primary purpose of the passage. So let's read in my words. Lippmann sets out to convince his audience to actually value and seek out opposing viewpoints rather than merely tolerate them. So that comes from the end because he very clearly builds to that purpose throughout. Now, I'm going to break it down. I'm not going to reread. Don't worry. But I'm going to show you. Here's how I would just pull back, and of course you'd see the whole thing in front of you. And I've identified. Here's the chunk of text that's the beginning, the middle, and then the end. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I'll spend some time on the next one. So I've identified the middle to be the first. I've identified the beginning to be the first two paragraphs. Here's my annotations again. Let's just take a quick glance at them. In the first paragraph, he identifies that freedom is an ideal rather than a need. And then he identifies society's hypocrisy regarding freedom of opinion. Now, again, I'm not summarizing, so I'm pulling out what's the writing choice? What's he doing effectively at the very beginning? So if I can take these two paragraphs and kind of say, what's the strategy that's overarching over both of them? Here'd be my topic sentence. Lippmann opens this passage by juxtaposing the truth of freedom of opinion with the myths surrounding the topic. Let's just take a second to go back and look at that juxtaposition. Freedom, what is the truth about freedom of opinion? What are the myths about freedom of opinion? Well, here he's talking about, in the first paragraph, it's an ideal rather than a need. So people say, we need it. But he's actually saying, no, it's actually an ideal. It's something that we strive to, but it's not a necessity. And then second, he says, and with that in mind, y'all like to say that you're big believers of our First Amendment, that you're big believers in freedom of speech, but you actually suppress, or people in our society actually suppress people who don't agree with them. So he's calling them hypocrites. So again, he's just cutting to the chase. Here's what people might believe, but here's the truth. Myth versus truth. Again, this would be my topic sentence. I want to make sure this is super clear. I'm not focusing on juxtaposition. Like that's not, I can't just say Lippmann begins with juxtaposition, or even worse, Lippmann uses juxtaposition in his article. That is too weak. I've got to tell my audience, or my reader in my essay what is being juxtaposed. And then I don't have a body paragraph for you tonight. I do have a previous live session, like I said, that's absolutely worth reviewing at any time. The second reason why this is going to stay away from summary is because everything that's to follow is going to be audience driven. And that's our live session focus next week. So this is really a two-parter. Hope you can come back next Tuesday night to make sure this is a great organizational strategy for rhetorical analysis. Be 100% sure you're not just summarizing. So I'm not tonight, even though sometimes it might seem like it, because I'm wording them. I'm not just labeling writing terms. But everything that's to follow this topic sentence would be, here's an example. Here's what the audience would be thinking. Here's how Lippmann's trying to change his audience's mindset, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a couple examples of what I would say. So let's just read two sentences. These would be two sentences of my body paragraph. So I'm not writing a whole one. I'm just writing a sentence or two for each of my body paragraphs. So I've already written my topic sentence. Now let's just look at a couple things. So I would say things like this. By calling out society's hypocrisy, Lippmann encourages his audience to self-identify what they truly believe about freedom of opinion. Again, that's analysis. That's getting into the speaker's head. He's thinking about the audience. This is what he's trying to do. So this is not summary. Again, This is the reason why it's not a summary focus. I'm splitting it beginning, middle, and end, but these type of sentences are what's getting me that 6, 7, 8, or 9 on my essay. Okay, I'd say something like this as well. Focusing on that beginning, middle, and end mindset. By opening up his passage, or by beginning his passage by addressing the myths of freedom of opinion, Lippmann forces his audience to think about the topic honestly before moving to his central claim. And that last phrase, before moving to a central claim, is a great writing technique because you're letting your reader know, I see the big picture. And that's so important for rhetorical analysis. Seeing the big picture is what separates mediocrity. And by that, don't misunderstand me. This is a time setting. This is a very challenging text. But when we're looking at, when I say mediocrity, I mean like that 4 or 5 range, like barely flirting with the college benchmark requirement or college level thinking and analysis. So big picture, I'm comprehending it. I know how he built his argument. Mediocrity, I kind of see some things. Maybe I can pull out a 4 or 5 even, but I'm not seeing how they're working together. This writing organizational technique from moving beginning to middle and end is all about seeing how the passage works together in unison to get the audience on the writer's side. All right, this is the middle. So I've got paragraphs 3 and 4 here. Let's look at the annotations. And then let's look at how I can kind of smush this together to say what's the overarching writing strategy in the middle of this passage. And a quick side note, if you're doing 2 body paragraphs instead of 3, apply this. It's just going to look a little bit differently. Maybe you're only going to talk about the first one and the third one tonight, or maybe you're going to split up your passage a little bit differently to say this is the first half and this is the second half. Again, don't worry about equal halves or equal thirds. Where do you actually see a shift in topic or tone? That's how you're going to split this work. Let's go ahead and look at passage, the middle of the passage. Just looking at my annotations. Lippmann notes the flaw in not truly valuing freedom of opinion. And he also criticizes the self-righteous view of protecting freedom of opinion. So again, let's smush those together. This would be my topic sentence for my second body paragraph. Lippmann highlights the dangers of the fact that society does not value freedom of opinion nearly as much as it says it does. So again, focusing on the dangers. Now this could start to sound like summary if all I do is say Lippmann says X, Lippmann says Y, Lippmann says Z. Let's move on to the next body paragraph. That is not at all what I want you to do. Let's look at an example of what my body paragraph might say. So again, putting it in that beginning, middle, and end mindset, that opens up doors to higher level analysis, seeing how the pieces work together. Once Lippmann's audience admits that society does not value freedom of opinion as much as it likes to say it does, the audience will become more ready to accept the dangers of this truth. Again, next week's live session is all about audience, but these type of sentences are what make a great essay. So get into the audience's head. Don't make stuff up. Just say, okay, this is what they would think. Like he's preparing them to accept a truth that they haven't thought about before. And then here's another one. By recognizing the dangers of not truly valuing freedom of opinion, Lippmann's audience would start to realize the need to change its mindset surrounding the value of differing opinions. So again, very audience focused, very audience driven. And here's our final piece. I cut out just like that transition sentence, and I just didn't have a ton of room on the slide. So there was like one sentence above it from the second to last paragraph that launches us into this last paragraph. My annotation here was he emphasizes the need to seek others' opinions rather than merely tolerate them. And remember, the primary purpose comes in the very last sentence pretty clearly. So this one's kind of split pretty nicely for me. Lippmann ends this passage by emphasizing the need to stop pretending to value differing opinions and start actually valuing them. Again, these would be my topic sentences. So I've given you 3 topic sentences looking at beginning, middle, and end. But your score is not earned in the topic sentences clearly. It's a piece of the puzzle. The score is earned with your analysis of what's to come. But I will say this is a very important thing to start practicing or thinking about. How are you going to organize your thoughts or the writing choices that you've identified? I believe going beginning, middle to end opens up doors to higher level analysis. For example, here's a sentence that I have in my third body paragraph. Once Lippmann's audience recognizes the dangers of society's current treatment of differing opinions, they will be primed to accept his call to action. Again, I don't say he ends with a call to action. I just state it what it is. But then I'm analyzing, getting into the audience's head. This works well in my essay as well as in Lippmann's article because of this. I've already spent time talking about the dangers. That was my second body paragraph. So I'm linking my second body paragraph to my third, and I'm doing a high level analysis of what does the audience believe? How is he getting them to change their mindset? Again, I've said it a couple times because it's so important. Don't summarize. This is not a summary approach. This is an organizational approach. This is an approach that gets you away from terminology, absolutely, but not to replace it with summary. So every sentence, this one, these, that is not summary. That's the analysis that we need. And next week, we'll be looking at even more, how do I get into the audience's head as I'm reading through this, and then how can I translate that into writing. So this strategy, beginning, middle, and end, emphasizes choosing the right writing choice. Again, I've read plenty of essays on this, just because I use it in my classroom, and every year there are times when I'm like, stop talking about pathos for an entire body paragraph. Stop talking about illusion. Maybe not this one, but just like in general, stop talking about one random thing that you saw for an entire body paragraph. What's he do at the beginning, middle, and end? How does repetition fit into that? Absolutely. For example, in the first chunk today, juxtaposition absolutely was something I would talk about. Let's go back. Here, this juxtaposition, absolutely something I would talk about within my body paragraph, but my topic sentence is here. All right, next week, all about the audience. Again, that's what this is hopefully building you towards. So, final reminders tonight. It's all about the audience. So that's why I'm launching into next week's live session with a really good live session tonight, looking at the speaker and the organization of the passage, but the whole way through, how is the speaker getting into the audience's head and either reinforcing a belief or changing the audience mindset. Again, no fancy terminology. You can say juxtaposition, absolutely, but that earns you 0 points. Let's be very clear about that. Don't try to impress your AP reader by using a fancy term, because that is not impressive to them. And then lastly, you don't have to do this strategy, beginning, middle, and end. I think it works well only when you see the beginning, middle, and end, how it's working together. But what you must do to get a high score is see how the pieces of the puzzle are working together, and also think about your organization of your essay. If you have 2 body paragraphs, why are you starting with the first one and ending with the second one? Or if you have 3, same. So why are you organizing your essay? Is it random or actually putting some thought into it? You must put thought into it. And again, the last word tonight, I believe, for reasons that we've talked about, the beginning, middle, and end organization opens up doors to higher level analysis. See how the entire speech or article is working together. All right, we're going to do some questions. All right, quick question from Beth. Is this one of the more challenging passages in terms of comprehension? To be honest, comprehension for rhetorical analysis kind of goes up and down. What I mean by that is the last few years, there's actually been some easier ones, but they've been longer. So I'd say, yeah, in general, this is in the harder half. I've seen harder ones. I'd say this one was pretty tough because of the sentence structure and things. So that's why my annotations are like, I focused on that a lot tonight. focus most on underlining the core phrase because it's easy, especially under a timed rush setting, that you could get lost in the extra phrases. So yeah, I'd say this is one of the harder ones, but I'm not saying that it couldn't be just this hard this year. That's why when I say take your time breakdown, 12 minutes out of 40 seems like a lot to be spending on just reading, but I highly recommend take the time, comprehend it fully, look for the nuance, and then start breaking it down. How is the author achieving his or her purpose? All right, so our next question, how important is knowing rhetorical strategy terminology? I know this question came and I probably started to address it. So not important at all. You can write a 9 essay without ever using a fancy term like juxtaposition, right, which I talked about. So thank you for the question. I want to make sure that that's very clear. Can you use terminology? Absolutely. But so many students who think terminology is the goal end up getting a 4 or 3 even on that 1 to 9 scale. So it's all about, and that's why I push you all away from the terminology through Fiveable. That's why you see my topic sentence don't use terminology. I might have said juxtaposing once, but it's very different than Lippmann uses juxtaposition, right? So terminology, you can use it, doesn't have to be used at all, so don't stress about it. It used to be, and I'll say one more thing here, it used to be on our exam, maybe 10, 12 years ago. I don't know exactly when they stopped doing it, that you would get multiple choice questions on, and they would have terminology. So like, what does the author use in this line? And it would just give you 5 random terms and you choose the right one. You might see that if your teacher uses some older multiple choice passage practice, but those questions don't exist anymore because College Board's trying to get us away from application of just random terms that you never need in life into critical thinking. So I'm very happy about that change, and hopefully you all are too. It's harder, to be honest. Our task is harder, but way more practical and useful than if I was just to say, is this anaphora, allusion, or apostrophe? Pretty useless. Not that you might not need it at some point in a college class, but in terms of critical thinking and in life, our essays now are getting to what is an argument and how can you have an effective argument. Okay, we got 2 more questions. And if there's any more, keep them coming. I appreciate you all asking questions tonight. What should be done at a conclusion? Great question. I get that question all the time. And let me go back to my slide actually very quickly, just as a preview. And I will let you know in 2 weeks, I plan on doing a deep dive into rhetorical analysis conclusions because I have not done that yet this year. I'll give you a quick taste of it for now. It's going to be way up here, just so I'm consistent with my language. Let's look at this. So you're going to quickly rehash the rhetorical situation. Again, you're only doing this in 2 minutes, so don't stress about it. But I recommend having one because it's a sign of just a complete essay. So again, I would just, in a nutshell, I would say, here's what the audience would be thinking about the subject before hearing Lippmann's work, and here's how Lippmann works deliberately to change their mindset. So he challenges their beliefs, and then ultimately he calls them into action to actually value someone's opinion as opposed to tolerate it. So it'd just be kind of hitting the basics and with a high level focus on audience, subject, and speaker. When I say provide a sense of closure, I'll talk about that in my live session in 2 weeks. A lot of that's just going to be based on your language that you use in your conclusion. You're just going to trigger to the reader. I'm done. Like, you can do that through some writing techniques. And I'll give you a model conclusion then as well. So thank you for the question. It's a great question. 2 weeks. I hope you can come back, everybody, to see that. Kind of more a thorough answer there. Last question. All right, so my teacher has mentioned to label every rhetorical, I'm assuming that's device. Is that a bad idea? Well, I won't say automatically yes or no unless I see like a practical application of that. So you could label it, but my caution there is that labeling is not the goal. Again, you can write a 9 essay if you don't touch like a special fancy term. However, if you know them and they're not the focus, use it. So let's go back to my example tonight. You could talk about juxtaposition. you're not saying the author juxtaposes and that's it. Let's just go back to how I worded my topic sentence. Lippmann opens this passage by juxtaposing the truth of freedom of opinion with the myth surrounding it. If this was just Lippmann opens a passage by juxtaposition, that's pretty weak. I have to actually put more context or thoughts there. So I will just answer this in a very abbreviated sense. My teacher has mentioned to label every rhetorical device. Up to you, but that's not the priority. So if your teacher wants you to do it, again, just make sure A, you're not mislabeling, because that would be a problem. It's better not to label than to label incorrectly. But B, that you don't think labeling the rhetorical device is A, the goal, or B, replacing high-level critical analysis like we talked about a little bit tonight, and we'll talk about more next week. I'm going to look over here just to make sure everything's been answered tonight. Thank you for asking your questions. So we say, this isn't related to your explanation, but would it be a good idea to include the historical situation? And then Beth answered, you could do that in your intro. Yes, thank you. Oh, I was going to give you a thumbs up, but I guess I can't. All right. So what I fully recommend is provide that historical situation as part of that rhetorical triangle. All right. Have a good week, everybody.